Have you ever thought that something small like getting coffee can have a much larger effect? It could alter your life's path? That's called the butterfly effect, and it rests on the idea that the world is deeply interconnected, so much so that one small occurrence could influence a much larger, complex system. Welcome to Truly Terrified, Paranormal versus Physics, where we talk about some really weird stuff and Joe the scientist explains how it's not possible, or maybe it is. I'm Lynn and...
I'm Joe.
Okay, I read a lot of stories of the supposed butterfly effect, but most of them really just showed the natural consequences of certain events. Like this story. This is just a perfect example of what people think are the butterfly effect. Okay, there was this guy who was given a bottle of expensive booze for his birthday. He drank the whole thing in the course of an evening, and he fell off a balcony. When he fell, he broke his back in multiple places, and he has spent months trying to recover. I don't think that's the butterfly effect.
That was it?
That was one of the examples.
So the butterfly effect is essentially you change some small thing or some small thing happens and later some large thing happens. I don't even want to say like the first thing caused the last thing.
Right.
But definitely that doesn't sound like the butterfly effect.
Here was a good...
It'd be like if there was a piece of dust in the air and he sneezed and that made him think, oh, I should go and drink. And then he...
Right. And then a whole bunch of different... But this story by Stephen King, I think really sums up the effect of the butterfly effect. Doesn't really tell how those steps come into play, although I came up with a scenario that would. But in this case, this is what the book is about. It's called 11/22/63, which if you don't know, that's the date that JFK was killed. He was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. So in this book, a young man named Jake discovers a portal which leads back to 1958. Only 1958. After a few visits and some experiments, he figures out that altering history is possible. No matter how long he stays in the past, only 2 minutes ever go by in the present. So he could go back there for a year and he comes back and only 2 minutes have passed. He decides to live in the past until 1963. So from 1958 to 1963, so that he can prevent the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. He believes that will greatly change and benefit humanity if he prevents JFK's murder. So after years of stalking Lee Harvey Oswald in the past, Jake manages to prevent him from shooting Kennedy. So he's happy he did what he set out to do and he returned to the present. He expects to find the world improved as a result of preventing Kennedy's murder. Instead, the opposite has happened. Earthquakes occur everywhere. His old home is in ruins. Nuclear war has destroyed much of the world. Horrified, Jake returns to 1958 once again, waits around, and resets history. The story 11/22/63 is a classic example of how the butterfly effect might end, but it doesn't tell all the nuances of how it happens because, as you said, it's unknowable.
Yeah. So actually, in that case, let's say the guy goes back for even a moment and he just like moves some stuff around in a room and then returns. That will have a huge effect. And so it's the fact that there's no way to predict.
Right.
There's just absolutely no way to predict. A really good example of that, I think, is just like literally anything in your life. And this probably could set a lot of people off, but every single little thing you do is having tremendously massive chance. Like if you had a TV screen that could show your perspective based on whatever you're currently thinking about doing in 10 years. If you just do whatever you think you're doing, the perspective will stay the same. But if you just shift it slightly, that perspective will just be a blur. It will just go all over the place from all sorts of essentially completely different lives.
Right.
Because there's so much change from the perspective of the initial conditions
I think that concept is a hard one for people to grasp. So popular culture presents the butterfly effect and almost always misuses it in stories like the drunk guy that broke his back.
Well, wasn't there like a few movies or something?
Yeah, there have been.
That kind of mischaracterized it, or just used, like for instance, The Secret or whatever. I think
they kind of touched on that.
Or What the Bleep or whatever it was called.
One of them. Yeah, they kind of touched on it. So here's a variation of a proverb that's been around since the 14th century in English and even the 13th century in German. And then Benjamin Franklin, never one to miss an opportunity to grab onto something and make it his own, he wrote this variation of it. For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the rider was lost. For want of a rider, the battle was lost. For want of a battle, the kingdom was lost. All for the want of a horseshoe nail. And that is probably the easiest way to explain it to somebody who doesn't really, or has difficulty embracing more complicated ideas. So the lack of one horseshoe nail could be inconsequential, and it is inconsequential, or it could indirectly cause the loss of a war. There's no way to predict which outcome will occur.
Yeah.
Because of that, true cases of the butterfly effect are impossible to pin down. The beginning act, the flap of a butterfly's wing or a lack of a horseshoe nail, are so inconsequential that they have to only be imagined.
And so that's kind of the thing. Like you say, was this tornado caused by a butterfly's wings? Not only can you just not know fundamentally, but because of the way you can't be certain about how things are evolving all the time, the best case is made that there was no causal relationship between the butterfly flapping its wings and the tornado. Basically everything is all the time contributing to those things probabilistically, because it just all averages out over time. It makes it so essentially everything is affecting everything else. And the best examples of the butterfly effect are literally just all over the place.
Yes, it's just that stuff's happening.
But you can't say, oh, it was A to B.
Right.
That causal relationship.
Right. And that's why the drunk guy drinking the booze, falling off the balcony and breaking his back is not the butterfly effect.
Yeah, if he could predict it at all.
Right.
Then
it's not. Yeah. Although the concept of the butterfly effect has been debated for a long time, you touched on the flapping of the butterfly wing and tornado. And the reason why that's one of the common examples is because the effect is credited to Edward Lorenz. He was born in 1917 and died in 2008. He was a meteorologist and studied weather, and he was a mathematician. He combined those two disciplines to create chaos theory. He always stressed that there was no way of knowing what exactly tipped a system. The butterfly is symbolic. It's a representation of an unknowable quantity. So can I tell you my story that I made up?
Okay.
This is my better imagined example of chaos theory. A man gets up and stubs his toe. Gets up from bed, stubs his toe. Unknowingly, he has set a small ball in motion across his floor. His cat chases the ball. Because his stubbed toe delayed him for a few seconds, he rushes out the door to go to work and forgets to close a window in his upper floor apartment. The cat is chasing the ball, batting it, and it flies out the window. The ball, not the cat. The cat loses interest and goes and takes a nap. Doesn't care. The ball, however, falls 10 stories to the ground, where it bounces into the air and comes to rest on top of a city bus. The bus driver is completely unaware. As he pulls to a stop at a light, the ball rolls down the windshield and bounces again as it hits the pavement. This time, it bounces several times and hits the spokes in a bicyclist's wheel. The biker swerves and his wheel gets stuck in a grate in a gutter. The sudden stop causes his phone to fall from his pocket and into the grate. The gutter grate leads to a sewer where a city worker is in the middle of turning a huge wheel to divert wastewater so that further down the line another worker can repair a damaged section of pipe. The phone hits him on the head, causing his hands to jerk on the wheel the wrong way. This releases a tremendous rush of filthy water into the area of piping where the other worker is busy. The rushing sewage hits him and he's swept away. This tidal wave of filth travels to an opening that's ordinarily closed, but its force pushes a valve open, and the waste comes pouring out of the opening into a river. Some kids are playing along the shore downstream, and the sewage washes over them. One of the kids becomes sick from this exposure and is hospitalized. The doctor who treats him comes into the room, limping. The kid says, "What's wrong with your foot?" And he says, "I stubbed my toe this morning."
Oh, yeah, that's good.
Yeah. And I think that's better. There'd be no way of knowing.
Yeah, no way of predicting.
No way of knowing.
Though it's interesting, if you look at any step in that process, you could predict a few things that could happen.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe even 1/100th chance that the cat jumps out the window or something.
Yeah.
And there's no way of knowing to connect. No way you could confidently say each step would happen.
Mm-hmm. Or that it would cause the next step.
Yeah, or it would cause the next step. But then there are also classes of systems where there's no way even to predict at any particular step. What, like for instance, butterfly flapping its wings, we're talking about the movement of the air.
Mm-hmm.
That's like you could quantify the air, all the air, but generally it's unquantifiable. The number of steps, quote unquote steps, of the air molecules moving, and those are influencing water droplets, and is just like there's no even one.
It's incomprehensible.
Yeah.
So it reminds me, and in my story, I think that would be a gross, as in large example.
Yeah.
And this is another large example, a gross example. So there was a guy who said that he believed that he could get a house or a car or something for free on Craigslist. And all he had was some little piece of crap, some little piece of junk. And he put it on Craigslist that he would trade it. Mm-hmm. And he traded and traded and traded and traded until finally he got whatever his goal was. Mm-hmm. And so when I think about the butterfly's wings, it might not be just the air movement, because that's an obvious, albeit unlikely, thing that would happen when the butterfly moves its wings. It might be the butterfly moves its wings, which attracts the attention of a bird, which, who knows what else could go into that. Mm-hmm. So the butterfly effect, by its very nature, is an unknown.
Yeah. Well, I think it highlights some interesting aspects of, I think, semantics. So the meaning behind things. We as people are essentially doing statistical observations of our environment. So we're collecting a lot of like discrete pieces of information and then processing that to render it down from the super huge amount of information to something we can comprehend. And there's just like a cyclical process of that happening in our brains. And so if we look at like let's say a ball, that is a huge, complicated, super complex system. But what we reduce it down to, what we filter all that information down to, is something simple in our brains. We've learned to simplify it. And if you drop the ball, you know what's going to happen because we've seen this happen before. You can simplify it to it's going to fall, and we're turning into it's essentially a story. But from the beginning to the end, it's a super complex system doing a super complex thing. You can still look at it and say, yeah, this is what's happening. The ball is falling and it hits the thing and whatever. There's something, it reminds me, there's something called a double harmonic oscillator, or a double pendulum, I guess. A double pendulum and triple pendulum, I think they've done it with, where it's a chaotic system. So no matter what you set it up at, initially, it will just behave chaotically. It's like 2 or 3 arms connected by joints, and it's like a pendulum, but the arms are free to rotate around each other. So it's you set it up and then let it go, and it does all these crazy flips and stuff. So there's no way to predict how it will behave, but some machine learning algorithms have been trained to control it. So to, like, for instance, balance the double, triple pendulum on its, so each of the pendulum arms are balanced upright. Okay. Which is insanely complicated. But that's exactly what the machine learning algorithm has learned to do, is to take this system that's very complex and find a model internally to control it essentially simply from its perspective. By that nature, we know that you can actually look at really super complex systems and know what's going to happen. So there are ways to the butterfly creates a vortex. Mm-hmm. The vortex is complex because it's made of air molecules rotating, whatever, but we can understand it. And then it does this and this and this. There's still obviously the uncertainty. Like even if you knew, you could not possibly predict how the things are evolving because there's uncertainty and the uncertainty is evolving. And so it's closely related to the concept of entropy. Entropy is very misunderstood. But in entropy, the study of entropy, there's the concept of a microsystem, a microstate and a macrostate. A microstate is kind of like the exact state of the system. So like every position and velocity vector of every particle in the air. Okay. So the macrostate is what we look at, when we look at it, what we identify it as. So like it has, it's flowing this way, or it's this pressure or whatever for air. Over time, entropy just always increases. There's just always more ways for like a blob of gas or whatever to evolve into something that we would recognize as just disordered state. Way more ways for it to do that than for it to evolve into a macro state we would call an organized state. And it's the same thing with everything. Every complex system, typically through its natural evolution, there's just any uncertainty that we have in it will be amplified. Even if it's like, okay, I'm pretty sure that the next step, there's a 99% chance the next step will be this thing. I know what it will be. Like in your story, I know, like the guy, he knows he's going to go to work, but that 1% chance of something else happening, something consequential, after so many steps, as long as those chances are not correlated to each other in some way that we can predict, you can be pretty sure that something will happen. So this is like butterfly effect, chaos theory, and all that is really interesting because it's not even paranormal. It's not normal. It's not paranormal. It's just like, it's just it. It's like we typically think of things like, oh, this is normal. We have a good understanding of it. It's highly predictable, whatever. Here's something paranormal or whatever you want to call it, that we don't understand. We don't have a good model for it. We don't know what it is. We can't see it or whatever. But then there's phenomena that are like, this is, how do you even characterize this? Speaking of entropy, if the guy was walking to work and suddenly all of the water molecules in the air coalesced, froze, turned into ice ball, fell on his head and killed him, that's completely possible, by the way.
How is that possible?
The water molecules are there. The energy is there to compress them. There's nothing stopping that from happening other than it's so unlikely that it just won't happen.
Well, now I have something new to be terrified of.
And as far as I know, there's not even any recorded instances in physics, in anything, in paranormal, the realm paranormal stuff, that has happened.
Well, maybe that could explain the cases where somebody just bursts into flames and burns up.
We live in an oxygen-rich planet. A fire starting is like totally obvious. That can happen. And it could just happen, like you could be moving across carpet and it could, but even that is really unlikely. And the probability of that is like vastly higher.
So I'm going to tell this story only because you talked about water molecules gathering into an ice bottle and falling on somebody's head and killing them, because this really happened. My great grandmother or something, way back in probably the 1700s, was walking down the street I think she lived in New York City. I'm not really sure. She was walking down the street and a brick fell off of the building and hit her on the head and killed her. I mean, it's a brick building.
Yeah,
so
so
you know.
what are the... So, okay, that actually opens up another kind of veer in the conversation. So what are the chances of that? Pretty low, right?
Pretty low.
Like no one's in the spot. No one's in the spot. The brick is not falling.
Right.
Then she's in the spot. The brick is falling, kills her. So let's just say that in these blind spots where there is the butterfly effect, you know, tiny disturbances being magnified crazily, that just because we can't identifiably say
what the beginning or the steps were.
There's something happening that something specific is not happening. So like, for instance, here's a off the wall example that I think it describes it. Let's say the butterfly flaps its wings and in the vortex is born a vortex sprite, ethereal entity that then moves the sprite over water and gains its ethereal energy until it turns into a tornado, you know? If there was no way to detect such a thing, like no way, just it was essentially equivalent to random action of the system, then there's no way to know that didn't happen, you know?
Right.
And you can say, okay, well, that's not like Occam's razor, that's not a really good model of how that works. Modern physics says, okay, we could know what's happening. There's not like any place for whatever I said, vortex sprite or whatever. And it's not a really good way to think, to say, okay, yeah, these like totally off the wall things could be happening and it's somehow meaningful that it is happening, or you know what I mean? And yet, again, it's like something like that absolutely could be happening.
And why not? I mean, it's doubtful, but why not?
Yeah. Well, it's also doubtful that the ball of water will coalesce and kill somebody.
Yes.
In fact, the probability of that may be higher than the probability of air molecules spontaneously becoming intelligent and turning into a vortex sprite.
I want to point out, because I found the newspaper article about the brick falling on my great multi-great grandmother's head. It just fell. There was nobody working on the building. There were no loose bricks up there. It just fell.
So you could say maybe the vibration of her walking, but it's like everything to line up to that point.
So the thing that comes to my mind is that the butterfly effect might actually be more, like you said earlier, that if you had a camera and you could watch everything that you were doing and, you know, see how just minute changes would alter the course of your life, the butterfly effect might also be contributing to some of the things that we do call paranormal.
Yeah.
Because we can't see the trajectory.
It's like scrying or whatever we talked about. I keep using that word like, just anything where you're looking at random noise and interpreting it.
I think that's probably pretty accurate.
Okay, what caused the noise? You know what I mean?
Right.
The noise, the butterfly affected the noise that you're seeing.
Right.
So all of this also reminded me of, I think it's called like the Global Consciousness Project or something.
That sounds familiar.
I think the idea was they took a bunch of quantum noise generators. So it's like a quantum number generator, whatever it's called. So the idea is you have a little device that measures quantum state and it's completely random. And then they have a bunch of them all across the world and they read them and look at correlations in the numbers they generate.
Yeah.
And there's like some statistical function they apply to it, and they get this curve. So supposedly, according to some people, when the curve is in a particular position, it's correlated with like events happening.
Right.
And I guess the idea is that all of the people across the whole world are thinking of, you know, they're controlling the random number generators, they're controlling events, you know.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
So it's like the brick falling. So maybe she was thinking, oh, brick's going to fall on my head, brick's going to fall on my head, brick's going to fall on my head. And then that influenced the butterfly creates
Who the hell
vortex
knows?
sprite or
And there's
whatever.
no way of knowing. And I think that's the most important part of the butterfly effect.
Yeah.
There's no way of knowing.
There's no way of knowing. And I think this kind of touches upon a metaphysical concept that I rarely see. That's like, we try to make models of reality to understand it and to be able to predict it and not be surprised by it. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that reality has any true model. So like, it doesn't actually follow any rules or any rules that are meaningful within within its own internal context. So like the butterfly effect, it might not be the best way to look at it that it's either A or B. A, it's a completely deterministic system and the air molecules are moving around, a butterfly flaps spring, blah, 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 blah. Or B, that there was the butterfly flaps, it swings, and then there was a distinct, like, highly likely thing, like a vortex sprite that is brought into being that was guaranteed to produce the outcome of the tornado. And you can't differentiate between them because you can't see the vortex sprite. You can't see all of the little things happening. But it might not be like true underlying model of reality might not actually, the distinction might not be possible, or it not meaningful at all. Idealists, so people who think that the world is primarily a conscious thing, the universe, reality, whatever. So that would be 100% guaranteed that your consciousness caused the brick to fall. So, I mean, there's a lot of those people.
Yeah,
that's what they believe. Or interactions between consciousnesses or whatever.
Well, it's kind of, there's a lot of religions that kind of push that perspective by saying, if you pray or if you have a positive attitude, and Scientology goes so far as to say that your previous imprinting on your psyche of events in your life will cause you to make events occur in your life. I think it's Scientology that thinks that. May be wrong on that, so don't come after me. So yeah, I think the beauty of the butterfly effect is that it is unknowable. Yeah. But that it's also so vast and amazing that it's kind of cool to think about.
Yeah, but I think the vastness and amazingness actually is an effect of the vastness and amazingness of just the universe. Like the butterfly and all of that, that was just the universe doing its thing.
So the butterfly effect, although I don't think my brothers called it this, that was one of the theories that they tortured me with unknowingly to give them their due, but it made me think of how the world might fit together in unimaginable ways, which really freaked me out as a child. Our contact information is in the show notes. You can email us, text us, or even call and leave a 3-minute voicemail. And as always, if you have a story you want to tell, send it to us. Please share, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and never be so terrified you can't run
away from the brick falling.